How are we all? Feel like it's been a little while since I've been on here, although I guess it was only last week that I did the interview with Matt Darling. No, it wasn't. It was 2 weeks ago. Yeah, it was a while. I got trapped out of my house. I was away, and then my housemate got COVID, so I like didn't come back. And yeah, that was basically it. So I've been, yeah, I was going to do another stream conversation with somebody, but then I didn't do that because I was trapped out of my house and the internet and microphone where I was terrible. And, anyway. And now it's really, really hot. So it was actually yesterday and the day before, it was actually too hot even to stream. Now it's like, I mean, it's hot enough, um, but it's probably just about cool enough to stream. So yeah, hello everybody. So I don't. So my basic plan for this one, and I'm sure there will be many of these. I've been wanting to do these for a while. These streams is I'm going to start by looking at the IPCC reports. I think they were the 2021 ones, right? Because so I didn't. Or were they 2022? So I wanted to look at these because we've broken records in the UK with the heat, and there's been fires, which isn't very usual for the UK. And I appreciate that fires can be very common in other parts of the world, and also they've noticed the effects of climate change more, longer ago. Not very articulate today. So yeah, so it's new to us in the UK to have these fires. It's not new to a lot of people, especially in the global south. But I thought I've been meaning to do this for a while, so we might as well learn a little bit about climate change. So there's climate change, right? How long is this fucking thing? There's climate change, right? And there's thanks for following, Ferry. And there's the economics of climate change. So both massive subjects. I feel like I want to learn a little bit about like climate change itself. I feel like I don't know quite enough about it. Um, Climate Change 22 impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. Is this? Are these the three? Because there was like three IPCC reports that were released at the same time, weren't there? It's hotter in the UK than in Mexico, yeah, or than where you are in Mexico. Yeah, that's pretty remarkable. It's not usual. Did I just imagine that there were three of these? I can only seem to find one. 1 second. 2021. What about 2021? The physical science basis, or maybe what I'm thinking of is they release three, one a year, and then and then they all kind of got builders coming together, even though they actually didn't. They were spaced out. You can only hear left. Oh, it always does this, right? I have figured out what it does, but it's like why? Okay, so it'll be on. It's not two channels. It's one channel. Right? That's not just left. Why does it do that? I don't have two audio channels. Um. Yeah, that should be fine now, everyone. Just it defaults back to like two channels. It's like, well, I don't have two microphones, so why would it do that? I've got one microphone, obviously. I'm not a fucking band. Climate change got me down. Do you have any advice to counter doomerism? Well, I mean, one thing about, yeah, I think We're in Hell has a good video about doomerism and utopianism as an antidote to doomerism. I think, it's easy to be kind of doomer about it, but I do think in a way doomerism is it's like another way of sticking your head in the sand, isn't it? And just being like, oh well, we can't do anything. Like, the consequences of climate change, fully hitting the world are so catastrophic that we should just fight for changing the economic system so that it doesn't happen. And I think there are some successes and they are limited. Carbon taxes being implemented in some places and elements of the Green New Deal being implemented. But yeah, I mean, doomerism just, I don't know. It's not going to help, right? So we're all fine on the mic anyway, aren't we? 230 people, bloody hell. Right, this is obviously a subject that people are very interested in. So I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to start reading this thing, which is, and I'll make sure it's all in line for you guys. Let me just double check that. By the way, off topic, you may have noticed my background. Does anybody know where you can get like a higher res version of this James Webb Telescope image? Because it might be okay for some of you. It seems to be okay on my OBS screen, but it's actually a little bit blurry on my actual screen, and I don't know. I don't know that. I mean, I know that the actual image must be high res, right? It must be higher res than it would need to be not be blurry on my screen. Reddit wallpaper. Reddit space. Okay, Reddit. James Webb. This is from the James Webb official website though, and it seems a little bit blurry. I don't know if it's the way it downloaded. But yeah, I mean, it is a good photo. Use this. Yeah, you're not allowed links on my chat because of spam. I might change that, but I haven't quite got a handle on spam yet, so we'll have to see. The actual image is like 100 megabytes. Yeah, this should be like, I don't know. Mate, that is too small, right? 164 kilobytes. 1.4 megabytes. I think that's the one I'm using, but it's too blurry. Anyway. What's my monitor res? 1 second. Monitor res. I don't actually know how to find out my monitor. Display resolution. Oh, 2560 times 1440. It's quite a big monitor. Yeah, 1440. NASA Web Original. Right, okay, wait. You got a high res. Right. This is a slight detour, everybody. We're gonna research climate change in a second, don't you worry. NASA Web Original. Right, see, this one looks better. Oh, okay, no, here we go. No, I think that might be right. Was that just today? Oh, that's much better. Yes. Well done, everybody. Thanks so much. There were plenty of valid answers there, but that Googling NASA Original, which seems obvious now, but it wasn't obvious for me, my tiny brain, originally. Right, let's learn about climate change. Sick of this NASA stuff. So this is a summary for policymakers. So I'm going to start here. I want to learn a little bit about what's going on and what scientists think of climate change, because I feel like I don't know enough about what scientists actually think about it. Like, I just listen to economists, and whether they're mainstream or heterodox, they usually don't know what they're talking about that much. We've solved climate change with the new wallpaper. Yes, we have. Do I see AoE 4? Yes, you do. When I complete Elden Ring, I'm going to go back to playing it on stream. Okay. All right. All right, everyone. Are you ready? Everyone, prepare. This already looks quite dense just from scanning it. This summary for policymakers presents key findings of the Working Group 2 contribution to the SICF assessment report. Right, okay, I can't read all that out. This report recognises the interdependence of climate, ecosystems and biodiversity in human societies, and integrates knowledge more strongly across the natural, ecological, social and economic sciences than earlier IPCC assessments. The assessment of climate change impacts and risks, as well as adaptation, is set against concurrently unfolding non-climatic global trends such as biodiversity loss, overall unsustainable consumption of natural resources, land and ecosystem degradation, rapid urbanisation, human demographic shifts, social and economic inequalities, and a pandemic. The scientific evidence for each key finding is found in the 18 chapters, blah 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 blah. The concept of risk is central. Risk provides a framework for understanding the increasingly severe, interconnected and often irreversible impacts of climate change on ecosystems, biodiversity and human systems, differing impacts across regions, sectors and communities, and how to best reduce adverse consequences for current and future generations. In the context of climate change, risk can arise from the dynamic interactions among climate-related hazards, the exposure and vulnerability of affected human and ecological systems. The risk that can be introduced by human responses to climate change is a new aspect considered in the risk concept. Oh, so I'd be interested to see what they mean by that. They're saying that we might respond in ways that just make climate change worse and fuck it up even more. Possible, entirely possible. The vulnerability of exposed human and natural systems is a component of risk, but also, independently, an important focus in the literature. Approaches to analysing and assessing vulnerability have evolved since previous IPCC assessments. Vulnerability is widely understood to differ within communities and across societies, regions and countries, also changing through time. Right, I think we're going to have to download this if we want to rotate it and, you know, do all that kind of fancy stuff. Right, here we go. 1 second. Just trying to make sure that chat doesn't interfere with it and vice versa. Right, so that's alright. And we got the nice telescope image just a little bit in the background as well to keep us optimistic. Adaptation plays a key role in exposure and vulnerability to climate change. Adaptation in ecological systems includes autonomous adjustments through ecological and evolutionary processes. In human systems, adaptation can be anticipatory or reactive, as well as incremental and/or transformational. The latter changes the fundamental attributes of a social ecological system in anticipation of climate change and its impacts. Adaptation is subject to hard and soft limits. Right, so, I mean, this is already pretty intense. I mean, it is a report about climate change. I feel like there's a lot of information that's been presented to us already. Thank you, Rainer, for being a fan. Is this a school textbook? No, it's an IPCC report. The IPCC report for policymakers. From climate risk to climate resilient development, climate ecosystems, including biodiversity and human society, as coupled systems. Climate change causes impacts and risks. Impacts ecosystems. Human society impacts ecosystems. Climate change impacts human society. Provision of livelihoods, ecosystem services is the impact of ecosystems on human society. Greenhouse gas emissions are the impact of human society on climate change. Okay, from urgent to timely action, governance, finance, knowledge and capacity, catalyzing conditions, technologies. Who is this report written for? Policymakers? Because I'm pretty used to jargon, and this is like, whoa. Future climate change. Isn't this just the same thing? Human systems transitions. So it's all about just the interactions, basically, right? This is... What about this figure, this note? Human society causes climate change. Climate change through hazards, exposure and vulnerability generates impacts and risks that can surpass limits to adaptation and result in losses and damages. Human society can adapt to, maladapt and mitigate climate change. Ecosystems can adapt and mitigate within limits. Ecosystems and their biodiversity provision livelihoods and ecosystems and their biodiversity provision livelihoods and ecosystem services. Human society impacts ecosystems and can restore and conserve them. B. Meeting the objectives of climate resilient development, thereby supporting human ecosystem and planetary health, as well as human well-being, requires society and ecosystems to move over, transition to a more resilient state. The recognition of climate risks can strengthen adaptation and mitigation actions in transitions that reduce risks. Taking action is enabled by governance, finance, knowledge and capacity building, technology and catalyzing conditions. Transformation entails systems transitions, strengthening the resilience of ecosystems and society. Arrow colours represent principal human society interactions, blue. Ecosystem including biodiversity interactions, green. Okay. And the impacts of climate change and human activities, including losses and damages, under continued climate change, red. In B, arrow colours represent the same, but reduced impact... Right, okay. I mean, in a way, it's quite basic. It's just like the feedback loops between the economy and the climate, right? This is really verbose. This is pretty wild. This report, like what? Like, I mean, I have a go at economists all the time for being terrible at public communication, but what are scientists doing with this? The IPCC. Like, what are the backgrounds of the people involved in this? Are they economists? Science head, science graphics, communications manager. Well, you need to do a slightly better job, I'm sorry to say. Science officer. Who is Hans Otto Portner? A physiologist and marine biologist. Deborah C. Roberts. PhD in urban biogeography. Honestly. Anyway, we're going to give it a bit more of a go. The unlearning economics icon. Yeah, it's already melting. It was very prescient, that. It actually comes from, there was an Economist article about the death of like economics and the death of economic theory in like 2010, and I used to have the picture from their article as my icon, but it was really like low res and a bit crap, and it was black, and it just like from a distance it just looked like a sort of puddle. So I got someone to do like a better version. So let's soldier on, because I wanna give this report a chance. Resilience in the literature has a wide range of meanings. Adaptation is often organised around resilience as bouncing back and returning to a previous state after a disturbance. More broadly, the term describes not just the ability to maintain essential function, identity and structure, but also the capacity for transformation. This report recognises the value of diverse forms of knowledge, such as scientific as well as indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, in understanding and evaluating climate adaptation processes and actions to reduce risks from human-induced climate change. AR6 highlights adaptation solutions which are effective, feasible and conform to principles of justice. The term climate justice, while used in different ways in different contexts by different communities, generally includes three principles: distributive justice, which refers to the allocation of burdens and benefit among individuals, nations and generations; procedural justice, which refers to who decides and participates in decision making; and recognition, which entails basic respect and robust engagement with and fair consideration of diverse cultures and perspectives. Right. I mean, that's all fair, but oh no, there's just too much jargon. Effectiveness refers to the extent to which an action reduces vulnerability and climate-related risk, increases resilience, and avoids maladaptation. Right. This introduction Right, okay. This introduction is like, I mean, it's an introduction, but they just keep chucking stuff out there. Oh, the mic gain's a bit too high. Oh, sorry, everybody. Mic gain's a bit too high. There we go, there we go, there we go. That should be fine. It's because I'm quite far away from it, so I turned it up a bit, but obviously too much. It has a very sensitive kind of spot where it just goes from basically being too quiet to peaking. Yeah, and it was like, yeah, it's like a shower. Always too hot or too cold, never just right. Okay, let's try section B. Since AR5, what does that mean? Is that one of the reports? Yeah, AR5, another. But I mean, how many? The fifth assessment report, AR5 of the IPCC. 3 special reports. I mean, how many of these reports am I supposed to read one of them? Yeah, assessment report 5, the previous report. Oh yeah, I see, okay. Right. The knowledge base on observed and projected impacts and risks generated by climate hazards, exposure and vulnerability has increased with impacts attributed to climate change and key risks identified across the report. Impacts and risks are expressed in terms of their damages, harms, economic and non-economic losses. Risks from observed vulnerabilities and responses to climate change are highlighted. Risks are projected for the near term 2021 to 2040, the mid-term 2041 to 2060, and long-term 2081 to 2100. At different global warming levels and for pathways that overshoot 1.5 degrees centigrade global warming level for multiple decades. Complex risks result from multiple climate hazards occurring concurrently and from multiple risks interacting, compounding overall risk, and resulting in risks transmitting through interconnected systems and across regions. Human-induced climate change, including more frequent and intense extreme events, has caused widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people beyond natural climate variability. Some development and adaptation efforts have reduced vulnerability. Across sectors and regions, the most vulnerable people and systems are observed to be disproportionately affected. The rise in weather and climate extremes has led to some irreversible impacts as natural and human systems are pushed beyond their ability to adapt. High confidence. Widespread, pervasive impacts to ecosystems, people, settlements and infrastructure have resulted from observed increases in the frequency and intensity of climate and weather extremes, including hot extremes on land and in the ocean, heavy precipitation events, drought and wildfire weather. Increasingly since AR5, these observed impacts have been attributed to human-induced climate change, particularly through increased frequency and severity of extreme events. This isn't really telling us anything new, though. This is what's annoying me. Like, I want to learn more than like what I already know, which is that there are there's higher average temperatures, more extreme weather events. There's like ocean acidification, deforestation, ecosystem disruption, biodiversity loss, right? We know that, right? I don't feel like I'm learning anything. I don't know about you guys. So this is confidence in attribution to climate change. This is kind of interesting, this. So if it's dark blue, navy blue, I think that is, then it's like changes in ecosystem structure, terrestrial, freshwater, ocean. So they think globally, all of these species range shifts and changes in timing, they're all high confidence attributable to climate change. But there's a little bit of variation here. So it's like medium in Asia, in the Antarctic it's medium, or there's not sufficient evidence, that's white. And then what? Increasing impact of human systems in panel, increasing adverse impacts, increasing adverse and positive impacts. So impacts on water scarcity and food production. So there's water scarcity, there's adverse and positive impacts on water scarcity globally. There's only adverse impacts on agriculture and crop production. We don't know with animal livestock, I think. There's only negative impacts on fisheries, only negative impacts on infectious diseases, with medium confidence. Only negative on heat, malnutrition, only negative on mental health, only negative on displacement, all with high confidence. Only negative on flooding, only negative on flood and storm-induced damages, only negative on damages to infrastructure, all with high confidence, and then medium confidence. Damage to key economic sectors, only negative. Okay, so there's some small positive impacts on like agriculture and so right. So that's like more previously like very cold land, right, or snow. You know, land that was snowed over will now become arable. It will become farmable. So those are like the minor positive impacts, but pretty much everything else is negative. All of the effects on like food and disease and malnutrition and the economy and everything. I'm kind of skipping over quite a lot of it because it's just kind of stuff that I felt like we already knew. I mean, these are the projections. Okay, so global surface temperature change increased relative to the period 1850 to 1900. What do these mean? SSP 1 to 1.9. Why is it not telling me? Is these different models? So these are different models, I guess? Or is that... No, I don't know. Why does it not tell us what they are? The low greenhouse gas emissions scenario. Oh, so it's just a scenario. So it's literally just saying if greenhouse gas emissions are low, they'll be this low. I don't fully understand, to be honest. So very likely range. Reason for concern. Unique and threatened systems, risk very high. Extreme weather events, risk very high, purple. Distribution of impacts. Don't know what that means. Does that mean it's an unequal distribution of impacts? The risk is high? Global aggregate impacts. Risk is moderate to high. Large scale singular events. Risk is moderate to high. SSP shared socioeconomic pathways, different scenarios of our behavior. So where's the detail on like what these scenarios are actually about, like what's behind them? I'm kind of... Right, okay, this might be interesting. Examples of regional key risks. Absence of risk diagrams does not imply absence of risks within a region. The development of synthetic diagrams for small islands, Asia and Central and South America was limited due to the paucity of adequately downscaled climate projections, with uncertainty in the direction of change, the diversity of climatologies, and the socio-economic context across countries within a region, and the resulting few numbers of impact and risk projections for different warming levels. The risks listed are of at least medium confidence level. Loss of terrestrial, marine and coastal biodiversity and ecosystem services. Loss of lives and assets, risk to food security and economic disruption due to destruction of settlements and infrastructure. Economic decline and livelihood failure of fisheries, agriculture, tourism and from biodiversity loss from traditional agro-ecosystems. Reduced habitability of reef and non-reef islands leading to increased displacement. Risk to water security in almost every small island. So these are some pretty serious risks to small islands. North America, right. Climate-sensitive mental health outcomes, human mortality and morbidity due to increasing average temperature, weather and climate extremes, and compound climate hazards. Risk of degradation of marine, coastal and territorial ecosystems, including loss of biodiversity, function and protective services. Risk to freshwater resources with consequences for ecosystems, reduced surface water availability for agriculture, other human uses and degraded water quality. Risk to food and nutritional security through changes in agriculture, livestock, hunting, fisheries, and aquaculture productivity and access. Risks to well-being, livelihoods, and economic activities from cascading and compounding climate hazards, including risks to coastal cities, settlements, and infrastructure from sea level rise. So, yeah. It would... Maybe we're getting somewhere. I mean, so just to guide you through the process of like how I'm reading this paper, by the way, I do like, I think what you'll find with a lot of people is they might assume that if you read a report or a paper, it's best to kind of read it just like start like a book and start reading it like from start to finish, right? You read the introduction, then the literature review, then the the methodology, then the results, then the discussion. But that's not the way to do it, really, especially if you're trying to get your head around it. I think one of the things that I find is really good is, yeah, sure, read the introduction, like read the first bit. But then what I tend to do is skip to some of the key figures and graphs because they often contain quite a lot of key information. And then you can look at them and start to try and like wrap your head around it, which is kind of what I'm doing here. Although I will add, with this report, I'm finding it like especially impenetrable. Not because I mean, I know like most of the jargon here. I just find it there's too much of it, and it's kind of in a way it's both verbose and terse. It's like there's a lot of words, but it doesn't go into detail on like it doesn't give like examples. It doesn't give any illustrative examples. And it's sort of it's very dense. Just like here's all of the information about climate change, and it's like okay. But anyway, I'm going to keep going. So, in Central and South America, you've got risk to water security, health effects due to increasing epidemics, in particular vector-borne diseases. What's a vector-borne disease? Oh, zoonotic ones. Oh, a living agent that oh, okay, yeah. It comes from a living agent, right? So, coral reef ecosystems are going to degrade due to coral bleaching, risk to food security due to frequent and extreme droughts, damage to life and infrastructure due to floods, landslides, sea level rise, storm surges, and coastal erosion. Degradation of tropical shallow coral reefs and associated biodiversity and ecosystem service values. Loss of human and natural systems in low-lying coastal areas due to sea level rise. Impact on livelihoods and incomes due to decline in agricultural production. Increase in heat-related mortality and morbidity for people and wildlife. Loss of alpine diversity in Australia due to less snow. Yeah, so that's Australasia. In Asia, urban infrastructure damage and impacts on human well-being and health due to flooding, especially in coastal cities and settlements. Biodiversity loss and habitat shifts, as well as associated disruptions in dependent human systems across freshwater, land and ocean ecosystems. More frequent, extensive coral bleaching and subsequent coral mortality induced by global ocean warming and acidification, sea level rise, marine heat waves and resource extraction. Declining coastal fishery resources due to sea level rise, decrease in precipitation in some parts and increase in temperature. Risk to food and water security due to increased temperature extremes, rainfall variability and drought. And Africa. Species extinction and reduction or irreversible loss of ecosystems and their services, including freshwater, land and ocean ecosystems. Risk to food security, risk of malnutrition, micronutrient deficiency, and loss of livelihood due to reduced food production from crops, livestock and fisheries. Risks to marine ecosystem health and to livelihoods in coastal communities. Increased human mortality and morbidity due to increased heat and infectious diseases, including vector-borne and diarrheal diseases. Reduced economic output and growth. And increased inequality and poverty rates. Increased risk to water and energy security due to drought and heat. One thing I don't understand about that is why reduced economic output and growth and increased inequality and poverty rates is only in Africa. Why is it not, well, everywhere, but also like it could easily be in Asia or Central and South America as well? Does it say that? That seems kind of arbitrary. Like it's like they've just done mix and match with all of these. I don't know. Um, I feel, but it's not. So these are just like, oh, here we are. This might be interesting. Okay. This is kind of interesting. So what are we gonna do about it? Nope, that's zoomed out enough. What are we gonna do about it? Um, just checking through chat, everyone. Thoughts and prayers, yeah. Exactly, right. So here's some actual concrete. So coastal socio-ecological systems. Coastal defence and hardening. Potential feasibility high. Wait. Yeah, potential feasibility. Economic, technological, institutional, social, environmental, geophysical. So these criteria are used to calculate the potential feasibility of one of these options. But are they explained? Are they explained in this text here? One second, let's go back to the actual text, because there are feasible and effective adaptation options which can reduce risks to people and nature. The feasibility of implementing adaptation options in the near term differs across sectors and regions. The effectiveness of adaptation to reduce climate risk is documented for specific contexts, sectors, and regions, and will decrease with increasing warming. Integrated, multi-sectoral solutions that address social inequities, differentiate responses based on climate risk, and cut across systems, increase the feasibility and effectiveness of adaptation in multiple sectors. Adaptation to water-related risks and impacts make up the majority of all documented adaptation. For inland flooding, combinations of non-structural measures like early warning systems and structural measures like levees have reduced loss of lives. Levies on what? Like charges. Oh, it's actually, like a physical levy. Oh, okay, yeah, no, that's fine. I'm so economics, I just thought it meant like a tax. So enhancing natural water retention, such as by restoring wetlands and rivers, land use planning such as no-build zones or upstream forest management can further reduce flood risk. On farm water management, water storage, soil moisture conservation, and irrigation are some of the most common adaptation responses and provide economic, institutional, or ecological benefits and reduce vulnerability. Irrigation is effective in reducing drought risk and climate impacts in many regions and has several livelihood benefits, but needs appropriate management to avoid potential adverse outcomes, which could include accelerated depletion of groundwater and other water sources and increased soil salinization. Large-scale irrigation can also alter local to regional temperature and precipitation patterns. Okay. Including both alleviating and exacerbating temperature extremes. The effectiveness of most water-related adaptation options to reduce projected risks declines with increasing warming. Okay. So as it gets worse, all of this stuff stops working. So, like, to give it a simple example would be, right, like your levy is obviously gonna, up to a point it's going to stop the water, but if the water is really, really high, water level's really high, then it's not going to stop unless you build like massive walls, and then you're like in a kind of basically underwater town surrounded by, like Atlantis or something, surrounded by massive walls, which obviously doesn't seem very feasible. So, effective adaptation options, together with supportive public policies, enhance food availability and stability and reduce climate risk for food systems while increasing their sustainability. Effective options include cultivar improvements, agroforestry, community-based adaptation, farm and landscape diversification, and urban agriculture. Institutional feasibility, adaptation limits of crops, and cost effectiveness also influence the effectiveness of the adaptation options. Agroecological principles and practices, ecosystem-based management in fisheries and aquaculture, and other approaches that work with natural processes support food security, nutrition, health, and well-being, livelihoods and biodiversity, sustainability, and ecosystem services. These services include pest control, pollination, buffering of temperature extremes, and carbon sequestration and storage. Trade-offs and barriers associated with such approaches include costs of establishment, access to inputs and viable markets, new knowledge and management, and their potential effectiveness varies by socioeconomic context, ecosystem zone, species combinations, and institutional support. Look, I mean, I get this is just a list. This report is just a list of things. Like, I can't. This is so annoying. How many lists were in that paragraph? Like, I literally just like, I don't know. Why are they not explaining everything? Like, this is for policymakers. I don't know. Like, it just doesn't seem to be explaining anything properly. It's way too dense. Just full of buzzwords. I'm pretty close to giving up on this report. I mean, so yeah, what does this say? Like, it's going to go higher. Climate resilient development, higher, lower. I might put that. I might have to submit that on Graph Crimes. I don't know. Am I being too harsh? I don't understand. This is the IPCC. Pretty diagrams, yeah. I don't know. Read the actual report. Which actual report? Is this it? Because this is just a bunch of lists. One second. Full report. Is this going to be any better? I really hope so. This is 3,000 pages long. um... Is this much better? Yeah. A 50-page abstract. It is like... I don't know. I don't know how actual policymakers, like, what they want, but I'm guessing it's tailored towards that, but it's just not really how I operate. So this is just like an introduction to climate change, this first bit. Yeah, okay, this looks like it's a little bit better written. but it is extremely long. So obviously we're not going to get through like much of it, but I might give this one a go now. Yeah, it's a big subject, and it is difficult to distill it into 50 pages. Okay. The footnotes are in weird places, but okay. So, contribution to the IPCC 6th Effect Assessment Report AR6 assesses literature on the scientific, technological, environmental, economic, and social aspects of mitigation of climate change. The report reflects new findings in the relevant literature and builds on previous IPCC reports. Blah blah blah. Recent literature highlights. The literature reflects, among other factors, developments in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change process, including the outcomes of the Kyoto Protocol and the adoption of the Paris Agreement, the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, including the Sustainable Development Goals, and the evolving roles of international cooperation, finance, and innovation. Recent literature highlights the growing role of non-state and subnational actors, including cities, businesses. If I read another list, I'm actually going to tear my own hair out. Close linkages. Oh, here we go. Here's another one. Close linkages between climate change mitigation, adaptation, and development pathways. The development pathways taken by countries at all stages of economic development impact global greenhouse gas emissions and hence shape mitigation challenges and opportunities, which vary across countries and regions. Literature explores how development choices and the establishment of enabling conditions for action and support influence the feasibility and cost of limiting emissions. Literature highlights that climate change mitigation action designed and conducted in the context of sustainable development, equity and poverty eradication, and rooted in the development aspirations of the societies within which they take place, will be more acceptable, durable and effective. Yeah, so climate change mitigation needs to be relevant, especially to poorer countries, right? Because they, might still want growth of some kind, or higher wealth or income levels, more technology, access to technology, and things like that. So. Is this just a fun live event, or is there a plan to publish this? No, I mean, it's just a kind of live thing. I mean, what's Nightbot saying? Has Nightbot been active? I thought I'd advocated. I thought I'd activated my bot, but obviously it's not working. But Nightbot should be working, and Nightbot would tell you, if it actually worked, that all of these streams are uploaded to the Unlearning Economics live channel. Yeah, so that it will be uploaded there, but yeah, it's not going to be uploaded to my main channel because it's just like I'm just trying to find out, along with everybody, what's going on. The report's summary for policymakers is a little less dry. What, the summary for policymakers? Wait, that was the one we were just on, though. That was the driest. That was the bloody driest shit I've ever seen. Why are the footnotes in the middle of the text? I don't. My whole thing, right? I'm trying to distill elements of academic economics to a general audience from across a variety of perspectives. I think one major issue here may be that I literally, like, this is too sciencey, because science papers are written very differently, and I just don't quite have the exposure to them to be able to distill this. Down. Like, there's just too much, you know. Like, I don't know all of the. I'm just like just as clueless as anyone when it comes to this kind of stuff. I literally can't read these papers properly. Although this is an interesting figure. Let's look at this. Emissions across regions. Okay. Greenhouse gas emissions per year. Gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. Eastern Asia is the highest. North America second. Latin America and the Caribbean third. That's interesting. Because I didn't think those were very high emitting or very populous countries. Central and South America. That's curious. And Europe's like a little bit lower than where I thought it would be. North America, the USA is pretty bad at emitting greenhouse gas. For sure. Australia, Japan and New Zealand, that's just because they're not very populous though, right? And then you've got historical cumulative net CO2 emissions. So that's North America leading there. And then Europe, okay, that makes more sense. Cumulatively, Europe is second. Eastern Asia third, but like presumably that's growing fast and eventually, you know, they probably will be first. Well, I mean, I hope not, but it seems that that's the trajectory we're on. Again, Latin America and the Caribbean quite high. Is this Oh, is this? That's a good point about exporting. I don't know if this is production. Yeah, here we are. Production versus consumption. Wait 1 second. We'll get to production versus consumption. So you've got like the where the emissions take place, but it's like if you produce a whole load of laptops in Taiwan and then they're all purchased in the USA, is it really fair to attribute those emissions entirely to Taiwan? Like, it doesn't seem so. So sometimes they do like consumption. So this is the per capita. So North America, highest per capita again. So Europe's pretty low per capita. I mean, still presumably over where we need to be, but Europe's actually much lower than I thought. But then again, it may be this production versus consumption thing. CO2 GHG production basis. So in production, Europe's 8%. North America, 12%. Consumption-based emissions, it's slightly higher. I'm not sure what CO2 FFI is. CO2 fossil fuel and industry. Oh, right, just. Not all. Okay, fossil fuel and industry, right. So that's a restricted definition, but this is interesting though, right? Because you've got Europe is 6.5% of total global production-based emissions, but 7.8% of consumption. And North America, again, 16%, but 17% of consumption. But the difference isn't as big as I thought it would be. But also, actually, maybe what's more important is the way it distorts. Right, so Eastern Asia, okay, this is, so it goes from 8.4 to 6.7. Right, so they do swap, right? So you see Eastern Asia is higher than Europe on production base. The amount of fossil fuel emissions in industry that takes place within their borders. But if you go to like consumption base, like who is actually consuming it, then Europe is higher and East Asia is lower, and therefore Europe actually moves to second, right, on consumption based, even though it's like fourth or fifth on production based. No, so that does kind of fit with, that does fit somewhat with what I was thinking. I wonder if they're Latin America and the Caribbean land use. Is that literally just like the Amazon? So that, you see that net CO2 from land use change, and forestry. Latin America and the Caribbean is like 3/4 that? That's just deforestation of the Amazon, more or less, isn't it? So that's kind of misleading, right? Because if you look at they're small, as you'd expect from everything else. You reckon? Okay, this is an optimistic document. Interesting. Figure SPM2. So, this part, the unit costs of several low emission technologies have fallen continuously since 2010. Innovation policy packages have enabled these cost reductions and supported global adoption. Both tailored policies and comprehensive policies addressing innovation systems have helped overcome the distributional, environmental, and social impacts potentially associated with global diffusion of low emission technologies. Innovation has lagged in developing countries due to weaker enabling conditions. Digitalization can enable emission reductions but can have adverse side effects unless appropriately governed. From 2010 to 2019, there have been sustained decreases in the unit cost of solar energy, so 85% decline in the unit cost of solar energy, 55% decline in the unit cost of wind energy, and 85% decline in the unit cost of lithium-ion batteries. And large increases in their deployment, so 10 times for solar, 100 times for electric vehicles, varying widely across regions. The mix of policy instruments which reduced costs and stimulated adoption includes public R&D, funding for demonstration and pilot projects, and demand pull instruments such as deployment subsidies to attain scale. So these are all this is all direct government funding. In comparison to modular small unit size technologies, the empirical record shows that multiple large-scale emission mitigation technologies with fewer opportunities for learning have seen minimal cost reductions, and their adoption has grown slowly. Policy packages tailored to national context and technological characteristics have been effective in supporting low-emission innovation and technology diffusion. Appropriately designed policies and governance have helped address distributional impacts and rebound effects. Innovation has provided opportunities to lower emissions and reduce emission growth and created social and environmental co-benefits. Adoption of low-emission technologies lags in most developing countries, particularly least developed ones, due in part to weaker enabling conditions including limited finance, technology development and transfer, and capacity. In many countries, especially those with limited institutional capacities, several adverse side effects have been observed as a result of diffusion of low emissions technology, such as low value employment, and dependency on foreign knowledge and suppliers. So you've had crappy jobs basically in combination with green technology. That's interesting because that's not the story you usually hear, right? I mean, I think one of the things that a lot of kind of green-minded people push in the West, in like the USA, is like green jobs are kind of good jobs. They're going to be better jobs. They're, I don't know, they're cleaner, they're higher skilled, high paying, and yeah, and they're going to be good for workers as well as for the environment. But this is saying that doesn't happen necessarily in poorer countries or countries with less developed governments and social systems. Low emission innovation along with strengthened enabling conditions can reinforce development benefits, which can in turn create feedbacks towards greater public support for policy. Digital technologies can contribute to mitigation of climate change and the achievement of several sustainable development goals. For example, sensors, Internet of Things, robotics, and artificial intelligence can improve energy management in all sectors, increase energy efficiency, and promote the adoption of many low-emission technologies, including decentralized renewable energy, while creating economic opportunities. However, some of these climate mitigation gains can be reduced or counterbalanced by growth in demand for goods and services due to the use of digital devices. Digitalization can involve trade-offs across several sustainable development goals, such as increasing electronic waste, negative impacts on labour markets, and exacerbating the existing digital divide. Digital technology supports decarbonisation only if appropriately governed. So here's the unit cost of some forms of renewable energy and of batteries for passenger EVs have fallen, and their use continues to rise. So photovoltaics, which I don't actually know what that is. Wait, is that what solar? Of course, why use a normal word when a fancy one will do? I guess that's slightly different to other types of solar power though. Onshore wind, offshore wind, concentrating solar power. I don't know what that is either. Well, so that's like using a mirror. Mirrors or lenses. Oh, okay. So normal. There's normal solar power, and there's this one. This is used more, but not as much as this one. Gigawatts. Share of electricity produced. But is that okay? So the price of these things has fallen, and the amount of energy produced with them has gone up, right? And it says the share, right? So the share of electricity produced by photovoltaics, our new word for the day, 3% is 3% in 2020. But has the share gone up? Or has it just risen, commensurately in proportion to like the general rise in the use of energy across the world, right? Because that would be, you want it to go up as a proportion, not just in absolute terms. Yeah, concentrating solar just hasn't gone up as much. Because it's kind of, if you look at this, I don't know, small sample size, but it's obviously 0, 0, 0 there. But then this is kind of like linear, so maybe, that looks more exponential, doesn't it? But again, yeah, actually, I think that's an exponential curve. Whereas this does look more linear, but it's early. It's early to say, I think, with the giant mirrors. Well, let's have a look at some of this. Can't fully see what's going on there. What's with all these low-res images on the internet anyway? Wait, so how do they work? Oh, so you literally... Oh, so it concentrates into that one receiver in the middle. That's interesting. Why do they have scaling issues? Yeah, so the receiver... Can I make that bigger? So some bounces off those into that, and then that kind of generates the actual energy. So I don't understand why those aren't... I guess... I don't understand why those aren't as scalable. MBAC, what do I think about making a video about ecological economics? I think so. I did one about the Green New Deal, which is very policy oriented, and it contains elements of ecological economics in it. But when I start doing this full time, which is not too far away, I may start doing like shorter explainer videos, maybe like between my kind of my longer videos, and yeah, I might start doing that, and then that is definitely something that I could do like an explainer on. Did you see the profile of Herman Daly in the New York Times? It was interesting. He's a bit of a strange guy. Well, not strange. He's just religious, which I guess I regard as strange. But I don't. There was a part where he was talking about Darwinism in that interview. Herman Daly, who's an ecological economist for anyone. He's like a really heterodox guy. So him having a profile in the New York Times was pretty unexpected. But he said some okay things about like degrowth, and then some not so okay things about religion, in my opinion. This does seem interesting though, this bit. So let's keep going here, because they're actually telling us something about policy now. So we're on the right track. The top panel shows global cost per unit of energy for some rapidly changing mitigation technologies. Solid blue lines indicate average unit cost in a year. Yeah, no. So we've already been through all of these, right? There has been a consistent expansion of policies and laws addressing mitigation since AR5. This has led to the avoidance of emissions that would otherwise have occurred and increased investment in low greenhouse gas technologies and infrastructure. Policy coverage of emissions is uneven across sectors. Progress on the alignment of financial flows towards the goals of the Paris Agreement remains slow, and tracked climate finance flows are distributed unevenly across regions and sectors. The Kyoto Protocol led to reduced emissions in some countries and was instrumental in building national and international capacity for GHG reporting, accounting, and emissions markets. At least 18 countries that had Kyoto targets for the first commitment period have had sustained absolute emission reductions for at least a decade from 2005, of which 2 were countries with economies in transition. Wait, so some countries' emissions have gone down in an absolute sense. Is that per capita or overall? The Paris Agreement, with near universal participation, has led to policy development and target setting at national and subnational levels, in particular in relation to mitigation, as well as enhanced transparency of climate action and support. The application of diverse policy instruments for mitigation at the national and subnational levels has grown consistently across a range of sectors. By 2020, over 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions were covered by carbon taxes or emissions trading systems. That's interesting. 20%, that's higher than I thought. I thought it was like as good as zero, like 5% or something. Although coverage and prices have been insufficient to achieve deep reductions, by 2020 there were direct climate laws focused primarily on greenhouse gas reductions in 56 countries, covering 53% of global emissions. Policy coverage remains limited for emissions from agriculture and the production of industrial materials and feedstocks. Yeah, right, okay, so we're not taxing greenhouse gas emissions and feedstocks like and industry and basically meat. Hmm. Okay. Just checking chat. Okay. In many countries, policies have enhanced energy efficiency, reduced rates of deforestation, and accelerated technology deployment, leading to avoided and in some cases reduced or removed emissions. Multiple lines of evidence suggest that mitigation policies have led to avoided global emissions of several gigatons of CO2 per year. At least 1.8 gigatons of CO2 can be accounted for by aggregating separate estimates for the effects of economic and regulatory instruments. Growing numbers of laws and executive orders have impacted global emissions and were estimated to result in 5.9 gigatons of CO2 per year, less than they otherwise would have been. Wait, so I'm a little bit interested in chapter 14, in some of this policy stuff. It doesn't actually give you... That's really annoying. It doesn't actually give you the page number. Where is chapter 10? I feel like chapter 10 is a chapter that actually goes into detail on some of the policies. Oh, actually, here we are. You can do it. You can do it from here. Um, No, it's not what I thought. Chapter 10. Now I have slightly lost my place. Whoops. Oh, for God's sake. So, let's close that one. It's pretty difficult to navigate that large document, especially when it doesn't give you the the chapters and stuff. But this might be worth looking at. Yeah, so problem is that all of these reports, and I mean I understand why they do it, they start with like a load of methodological choices. And like definitions and stuff, and it's just like it's not actually good to read kind of just by itself. You've got to kind of skip past it. Hmm. Yeah, I'd say it does add complexity. A lot of it. I mean, what about the energy systems report? Is this like? Right. Okay, we're on energy. We're on energy systems. So, okay, this is exactly the type of thing that I'm looking for, right? Some detail on like how we need to change our energy systems, how fast, how we do it, the likely effects if we don't. So, in fact, let's download this so that I've got proper access to it. Cool. Okay. Warming cannot be limited to well below 2 degrees centigrade without rapid and deep reductions in energy system CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. In scenarios limiting likely warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade with limited overshoot, likely below 2 degrees centigrade, net energy system CO2 emissions, the interquartile range, fall by 87 to 97%. Or 70 to 79%. Is that is that the 1.5 degrees C versus 2 degrees C, I think. So for 1.5 degrees it's 87 to 97%. There's a typo there and there's 2 percentage marks. And for the 2 degrees limit, it's 60 to 79% in 2050. In 2030, in scenarios limiting warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade with no or limited overshoot, net CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions fall by 35 to 51% and 38 to 52% respectively. In scenarios limiting warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade with no or limited overshoot, likely below 2 degrees centigrade, net electricity sector CO2 emissions reach zero globally, zero carbon from the electricity sector between 2045 and 2055. But for 2 degrees centigrade, that's 2050 and between 2050 and 2080. So conservatively, you would say, yeah, you're just having to basically limit CO2 emissions to zero, right? This is the IPCC report from this year. Yeah, let me double check that. Oh, that's something else. Yeah, mitigation of climate change. So this is like the policymaker report. Pansagi. So this is like massive, complete conversion of the global energy system to renewables. What threshold they're using for high confidence? It should be. Here we are. Confidence 5. Yeah, so a level of confidence is expressed using 5 qualifiers typed in italics: very low, low, medium, high, and very high. The assessed likelihood of an outcome or a result is described as virtually certain, very likely. No, so those are different. So I don't know. Maybe it means 99 to 100%. High confidence. I'm not sure. That seems like they're confidence versus the likelihood. They're two different things, right? But then it doesn't tell you what percentage these are. So I don't know. I don't know what high confidence means exactly. They only have high, medium, and low, I think. Yeah, trust me, bro. It's high confidence. So, okay. Limiting warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade will require substantial energy system changes over the next 30 years. This includes reduced fossil fuel consumption, increased production from low and zero carbon energy sources, and increased use of electricity and alternative energy carriers. Coal consumption without CCS carbon. I don't know what CCS is. Carbon capture storage, is that what that is? Falls by 67% to 82%. In 2030, in scenarios limiting warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade with no or limited overshoot. Oil and gas consumption fall more slowly. Low carbon sources produce 93 to 97% of global electricity by 2050 in scenarios that limit likely warming to 2 degrees centigrade or below. In scenarios limiting warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade with no or limited overshoot, electricity supplies 48% to 58% of final energy in 2050, up from 20% in 2019. So we need to use electricity a lot more. Okay. Not as much as I might have thought, but yeah. Net zero energy systems will share common characteristics, but the approach in every country will depend on national circumstances. Common characteristics of net zero energy systems will include electricity systems that produce no net CO2 or remove CO2 from the atmosphere, widespread electrification of end uses including light-duty transport, space heating and cooking, substantially lower use of fossil fuels than today, use of alternative energy carriers such as hydrogen, bioenergy and ammonia to substitute for fossil fuels in sectors less amenable to electrification. Ammonia. Is that clean? I don't know. Doesn't sound clean. More efficient use of energy than today and greater energy system integration across regions and across components of the energy system. And use of CO2 removal to offset any residual emissions. DACs and BECs. I don't know what those are. They're like carbon storage, right? Carbon capture and storage. Energy demands and energy sector emissions have continued to rise. From 2015 to 2019, global final energy consumption grew by 6.6%. CO2 emissions from the global energy system grew by 4.6%, and total greenhouse gas emissions from energy supply rose by 2.7%. Methane emissions, mainly fugitive emissions from oil, gas and coal, accounted for 18% of greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. Coal electricity capacity grew by 7.6%, as new builds in some countries offset declines in others. Total consumption of oil and oil products increased by 5%, and natural gas consumption grew by 15%. Declining energy intensity in almost all regions has been balanced by increased energy consumption. Yeah. So that's the familiar, like, Jevons paradox, which is when something increases in efficiency, but people end up using more of it to the extent that it offsets or even outpaces the gain in efficiency. So it's like, you know, we now just like, content's a good example, right? It's like, it's so much more efficient. Computers are so much more efficient than they were. The internet's more efficient, like per megabyte of data sent. But because we use the internet so much more, and we've got like streaming, very high intensity activities like now, we're still like using more than we were, right? Because people just end up completely offsetting the gains in efficiency. Prices have dropped rapidly over the last 5 years for several key energy system mitigation options, notably solar PV, wind power and batteries. From 2015 to 2020, the prices of electricity from PV and wind dropped 56% and 45% respectively, and battery prices dropped by 64%. Electricity from PV and wind is now cheaper than electricity from fossil fuels in many regions. Electric vehicles are increasingly competitive with internal combustion engines, and large-scale battery storage on electricity grids is increasingly viable. Global wind and solar PV capacity and generation have increased rapidly. Solar PV grew by 170% to 680 terawatt hours. Wind grew by 70% to 1400 terawatt hours from 2015 to 2019. That is really fast. Policy and societal pressure to limit fossil generation, low interest rates and cost reductions have all driven wind and solar PV deployment. That's interesting, low interest rates. Because that's like a direct effect that central bank policy has had on green technology. Having low interest rates has actually improved, presumably, relative to the counterfactual, the adoption of green technology. Excuse me. Solar PV and wind together accounted for 21% of total low-carbon electricity generation and 8% of total electricity generation in 2019. Nuclear generation grew 9% between 2015 and 2019 and accounted for 10% of total generation in 2019. Hydroelectric power grew by 10% and accounted for 16% of total generation. In total, low and zero carbon electricity generation technologies produced 37% of global electricity in 2019. High confidence. So that's a lot, right? But we're still well outstripping the limits. Like our emissions are still rising. I guess it is just again because like the total amount we're using is rising so much. But even if these grow as a percentage, it's like still way too many emissions. If investments in coal and other fossil infrastructure continue, energy systems will be locked into higher emissions, right, making it harder to limit warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade. Many aspects of the energy system, physical infrastructure, institutions, laws and regulations and behaviour are resistant to change or take many years to change. New investments in coal-fired electricity without CCS, carbon capture storage, are inconsistent with limiting warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade. Okay, so we shouldn't invest in coal, that makes sense. Are we? My guess would be that we are investing in coal. Oh, hello. That's funny that you just popped up there, coal hater. Hello. Yeah, OM, I agree. It is all about absolute terms. Like it's like relative terms is like relative is what humans care about, right? Like we're very relative beings in terms of how we evaluate things, performance and like ourselves as well. We compare to the past and we compare to others and things like that. But nature, while some things are relative in nature, it doesn't care, right? It doesn't care if we're improving in relative terms. The tipping points that exist, the changes in weather are literally absolute values, right? So it's gonna happen even if we make some type of relative improvement. Did I not read when you defined what those terms mean? Soup Emporium? No, I didn't. I must have missed it. I'm sorry. What do you think of something like a development bank to keep interest rates low for renewable energy innovations? I think that sounds like a pretty good idea. Yeah, like an investment bank. I mean, like a national investment bank that's like funded by central banks, and it extends low interest loans, even if we for some reason have to increase interest rates, which, you know, there are scenarios under which you can imagine that being the case. This specific bank doesn't for green technologies. That seems like a pretty sensible idea. Thanks, Soup Emporium. Wait, someone just asked me something. Oh, botched mandala. Degrowth, yeah, I mean, the thing with degrowth is, I think it's kind of a bad name. And I don't like the idea that we'd be targeting negative GDP growth. For a lot of reasons. Number one among them being that GDP like hides a lot, right? It's weird. It's a strange number. There's a lot of strange things that go into the calculation of GDP. So for it to be negative doesn't necessarily mean we're doing the right things. What I do agree with the degrowthers on is that we need some sectors of the economy to like shrink. So you can imagine, for example, fossil fuels being the premier example, concrete production, meat. You can imagine like more superfluous industries, right? Like what David Graeber called bullshit jobs, those types of things. You can imagine those reducing. You can imagine like reducing the work week. That may have a big effect on a big reduction in terms of carbon emissions and in terms of our like resource usage. So you can imagine those things. But then at the same time, what we also need is a massive amount of growth in other areas. So growth in like renewable energies, investment in that, investment in like greener transportation, like greener cities. So the net effect on GDP is not something that I really care about. I'm just like much more of a let's do these policies on a case by case basis. We've reached 1,000 messages, everyone. Everyone's very lively about this. Okay, let's continue with this article then. Limiting warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade will strand fossil-related assets, including fossil infrastructure and unburned fossil fuel resources. The economic impact of stranded assets could amount to trillions of dollars. Coal assets are most vulnerable over the coming decade. Oil and gas assets are more vulnerable toward mid-centuries. CCS can allow fossil fuels to be used longer, reducing potential stranded assets. So they don't want us to leave oil fields not drilling for oil. So they prefer that we burn the fossil fuels that we have, essentially, or that we have easy access to, and then use carbon capture storage. They seem to be pretty confident in CCS so far in this. I don't know like what I don't know to what degree it's driving their like predictions and stuff. So, a low carbon energy transition will shift investment patterns and create new economic opportunities. Total energy investment needs will rise relative to today over the next decades if lightly warming is limited to 2 degrees or below. These increases will be far less pronounced, however, than the reallocations of investment flows that are likely to be seen across subsectors, namely from fossil fuels. Without CCS and towards renewables, nuclear power, CCS, electricity networks and storage, and end-use energy efficiency. A significant and growing share of investments between now and 2050 will be made in emerging economies, particularly in Asia. Climate change will affect many future local and national low-carbon energy systems. The impacts, however, are uncertain, particularly at the regional scale. Climate change will alter hydropower production, bioenergy and agricultural yields, thermal power plant efficiencies, and demands for heating and cooling, and it will directly impact power system infrastructure. Climate change will not affect wind and solar resources to the extent that it would compromise their ability to reduce emissions. Well, that's kind of a piece of good news. I mean, it does interest me. There's this whole like air conditioning debate, isn't there? Like everyone's talking about air conditioning because in the US, and I know a lot of my viewers are from the US, you guys just have like air conditioning everywhere. And we just don't really have it as a rule in Europe. Some of the Mediterranean countries and the cities there, people have air conditioning, but it's just not very common. It's certainly not the default for a house because Europe doesn't get that hot, right? But obviously, there's a welfare issue Like, people do die from the heat, and it's fair to say that people should be comfortable and, you know, especially not get heat stroke or die or whatever. And but air conditioning uses a lot of energy, right? I mean, you can have air conditioning powered by solar power, I guess. We all need like solar panels on our roofs which power our houses, but I don't know how feasible that is, right? Like, yeah. So yeah, I don't know. It'd be interesting to look into that, like AC, because someone once told me that there are ways of designing buildings, and this is where like some of the interesting stuff about like indigenous knowledge comes in. Because there are areas of the world that have been very hot for a long time, but had people in them, and people haven't had modern technology there like AC units, but they've kept relatively cool. And the question is, how did they do that? And there are ways of like building dwellings without AC, without using excessive energy that can aid that, right? So that's an interesting passive houses. Is that what they're called? Is that the ones with? Yeah. Passive houses. Passive design is not an attachment or supplement to architectural design, but a design process that integrates with architectural design. Although it is principally applied to new buildings, it has also been used for refurbishments. By late 2008, estimates of the number of passive house buildings around the world ranged from 15,000 to 20,000 structures. In August 2010, there were approximately 25,000 certified structures in all of Europe. The vast majority of passive structures have been built in German-speaking countries and Scandinavia, of course. So, in Germany, it is now possible to construct buildings for the same cost as those built to normal German building standards. On average, passive houses are reported to be more expensive upfront, 5 to 8% more expensive, 8 to 10% in the UK, and 5 to 10% in the USA. The costs of meeting it increase significantly when you're in northern Europe above 60% latitude. 60% latitude is like, yeah, Scandinavia, Russia, Alaska, Helsinki. London's at 51 degrees. Wait, so why are we not doing this if this is... Why are we not doing it? It's not that much. Well, I'm just catching up on chat because there's some interesting stuff here. Radiative cooling. Thermoacoustic cooling. Terracotta cooling. It's easy to keep cool if you don't have to do stuff. Yeah, that's true. Double glazed windows, proper insulation, close windows in the day and open them at night. That is interesting because that is kind of the opposite of what most people do. The problem is as well, the street lights in cities are so fucking bright that if you open your windows at night, then you're not going to sleep. Yeah. The most recent video by Nighthawk in Light shows you how to make infrared reflective paint, which can reduce the temperature of a building by 20 degrees compared to the surrounding ambient temperature. That's pretty impressive. Is that 20 Fahrenheit or 20 Celsius? My guess is 20 Fahrenheit. 20 Celsius would be... Well, I don't know, maybe. Maybe if it's at 40, then it's inside, it's at 20. I don't know. Yeah. It seems like 20 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Yeah, okay. Swamp cooling in low humidity environments. Geothermal cooling is actually really easy to implement most places since the ground is usually 10 degrees centigrade. Passive solar homes and water heaters existed in the 1940s, but the electrical companies made developers hook up only electric utilities if they wanted to get access to grid electricity. Wow. Yeah, Bard, the stream will be available on. I mean, it'll be unlisted on my channel in a playlist, but it'll also be uploaded to the Unlearning Economics Live channel. The UK isn't doing it because Cameron killed the program. That is true. In the UK, he stopped subsidising all of that stuff, and now not only is it worse for the environment and worse for people's well-being, it's also part of the cost of living crisis because energy is so expensive. You are going to find yourself away that a lot researching this topic. I don't know what you mean. Terracotta cooling. I'd love to see the numbers on emissions if all AC systems that could be replaced by heat pumps were. 20C is a lot. Yeah. Yeah, so... Yeah, I don't know. Like, this is like... This seems like something that could very easily be done, but is it just like... Like, why do we not have passive housing? Is the answer capitalism? I don't understand though, wouldn't it? I mean, is the answer the existing power of energy companies? Existing energy companies who, like, literally, you know, don't want to see people being able to provide their own energy. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. So, yeah, so let's finish this bit. Climate change will affect many future local and national low-carbon energy systems. The impacts, however, are uncertain, particularly at the regional scale. Climate change will alter hydropower production, bioenergy and agricultural yields, thermal power plant efficiencies, and demands for heating and cooling, and it will directly impact power system infrastructure. Climate change will not affect wind and solar resources to the extent that it would compromise their ability to reduce emissions. Oh, we already read that, sorry. Electricity systems powered predominantly by renewables will be increasingly viable over the coming decades, but it will be challenging to supply the entire energy system with renewable energy. Large shares of variable solar PV and wind power can be incorporated in electricity grids through batteries, hydrogen, and other forms of storage, transmission, flexible non-renewable generation, advanced controls, and greater demand-side responses. Because some applications, such as air travel, are not currently amenable to electrification, 100% renewable energy systems would likely need to include alternative fuels such as hydrogen or biofuels. Economic, regulatory, social, and operational challenges increase with higher shares of renewable energy, electricity, and energy. The ability to overcome these challenges in practice is not fully understood. Yeah. Okay, so you can't electrify everything like air travel. I mean, air travel is just something that needs to be reduced massively, right? Multiple energy supply options are available to reduce emissions over the next decade. Nuclear power and hydropower are already established technologies. Solar PV and wind are now cheaper than fossil-generated electricity in many locations. Bioenergy accounts for about a tenth of the global primary energy. Carbon capture is widely used in the oil and gas industry, with early applications in electricity production and biofuels. It will not be possible to widely deploy all of these and other options without efforts to address the geophysical, environmental, ecological, economic, technological, socio-cultural, and blah 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 words. Too many words. Do not cite, quote, or distribute. What? This is fucking publicly available. Obviously it's going to get distributed, including by me. Some mitigation options can provide more immediate and cost-effective emissions reductions than others, but a comprehensive approach will be required over the next 10 years to limit warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade. There are substantial, cost-effective opportunities to reduce emissions rapidly in several sectors, including electricity generation and light-duty transportation. But near-term reductions in these sectors will not be sufficient to limit warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade. A broad-based approach across the energy sector will be necessary to reduce emissions over the next 10 years and to set the stage for deeper reductions beyond 2030. Wow, I just followed one of your... one second, we'll read that in a second. Thank you, Derp Feast. Enhancing integration across energy system sectors and across scales will lower costs and facilitate low-carbon energy systems transitions. Greater integration between the electricity sector and end-use sectors can facilitate integration of variable renewable energy options. Energy systems can be integrated across district, regional, national, and international scales. The viable speed and scope of low-carbon energy system transition will depend on how well it can support sustainable development goals and other societal objectives. Energy systems are linked to a range of societal objectives including energy access, air and water pollution, health, energy security, water security, food security, economic prosperity, international competitiveness, and employment. These linkages and their importance vary among regions. Energy sector mitigation and efforts to achieve SDGs generally support one another, though there are important region-specific exceptions. The economic outcomes of low-carbon transitions in some sectors and regions may be on par with or superior to those of an emissions-intensive future. Cost reductions in key technologies, particularly in electricity and light-duty transport, have increased the economic attractiveness of near-term low-carbon transitions. Long-term mitigation costs are not well understood and depend on policy design and implementation, and the future costs and availability of technologies. Advances in low-carbon energy resources and carriers such as next-generation biofuels, hydrogen produced from electrolysis, synthetic fuels, and carbon-neutral ammonia would substantially improve the economics of net zero energy systems. Okay, so not everything can be electricity, right? It's just like, whoa, wait. This seems like it might be fruitful, actually, this thing. Let me just look at this thing. Is this ethical consumer? Following the pay to pollute court case, Francesca Willow, explains how the UK government funnels public money into fossil fuel companies. In the wake of COP26 in Glasgow, governments across the world have come under heightened scrutiny there we go. For the support they provide to the fossil fuel industry. Despite branding itself as a climate leader, the UK government has faced particular pushback from campaigners as policy decisions show these claims to be nothing more than empty words. A welcoming place for fossil fuel companies. Currently, the UK's tax regime makes it the most profitable country in the world to develop big offshore oil and gas projects. Most spending on oil and gas exploration can be offset against tax, as it is classified as research and development. Okay, so there you go. Stop doing that. Almost all spending on new fields can be offset in the first year of development, and companies can claim tax relief for decommissioning offshore installations. Since the Paris Agreement, the government has provided £13.6 billion in subsidies to the UK oil and gas industry. From 2016 to 2020, companies received £9.9 billion in tax relief for new exploration and production, including £15 million of direct grants for exploration and £3.7 billion in payments towards decommissioning costs. Is that... I mean, obviously this is absurd, right? That they're doing that, but they've got subsidies for new exploration and production, but also subsidies for decommissioning. It's like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. But also, having said that, taken alone, would you say this is good? Decommissioning? Right, like, I mean, if that's what it takes, nobody likes subsidizing fossil fuel companies, right? Nobody wants that, but it's like, I would say alone, that is good, right? Even if it's unsavory. It's unsavory, but if the end is like not climate catastrophe, then okay. Pay to pollute legal case. These subsidies were highlighted at the end of 2021 as the pay to pollute case was heard at the High Court. Blah, 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 blah. The state-owned oil and gas authorities' approach to offshore oil and gas is unlawful. While the hearing in the High Court was scheduled to take 2 days, the efficiency of the legal teams meant that it wrapped up in one. The hearing followed a public panel with the claimants on December 6th and a rally which was held on December 7th near the courts, support from a coalition of environmental groups, activists and the general public. In early January 2022, the High Court ruled against the claimants, but while this might be a setback, the fight is far from over. While the claimants consider grounds for appeal, it is vital to remember that this case has always been part of a larger movement. One ruling alone cannot achieve climate justice, and this case has still seen major successes. More importantly, the UK government had to concede that oil and gas companies may make more from subsidies than they pay in tax. The government has previously denied this fact, but in an unprecedented development, or forced to admit it in public record in the High Court. Interesting. While the court may not have ruled it as unlawful, forcing the government to be truthful about unacceptable levels of profits for oil and gas companies is key to shaping future conversation and resistance to the fossil fuel industry. The court case laid out the stark reality of a tax and subsidy system that props up the oil and gas sector at great cost to the UK taxpayer. In 2015, the UK legislated an official policy of maximising economic recovery of oil and gas in the North Sea. This doesn't refer to economic recovery after significant damage, instead it is a commitment to continued drilling and exploration until there's no oil and gas left. Burning the oil and gas in current operational offshore fields would already exceed the UK's fair share of the Paris goals. So the oil and gas that we've got now is already too much. So there's no point continuing drilling if we want to meet the Paris goals. Do we? I don't know. It doesn't stop there. Oil and gas companies also aggressively lobbied the governments for massive tax cuts, meaning giants like Shell and BP have paid next to nothing in tax while receiving hundreds of millions in handouts. Simultaneously, the UK receives less money from fossil fuel producers than its neighbours. In Norway, the government receives about $21 per barrel of oil, while the UK receives less than $2. This amounts to the UK taxpayer propping up big polluters who give nothing in return, all the while risking the future of the planet. To avoid the worst of climate breakdown, oil and gas production needs to rapidly decline and no new fossil fuels can be extracted. In the High Court, the claimants challenged the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, currently Kwasi Kwarteng, and the OGA, the state-owned oil and gas authority. Of the 30 members of the OGA's board and senior management team, 8 previously worked in the oil and gas industry and 3 still hold shares in oil companies, including the OGA chair, Tim Egger. The activists argued that the policy of maximising economic recovery fails to account for the billions of pounds of public money that are already used to support the oil and gas sector. Instead, it encourages production of oil and gas that benefits the industry rather than the entire UK. They also stated that the OGA's strategy is irrational and inconsistent with the UK's legal duty to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, as it will lead to more extraction and therefore more emissions than if fossil fuels are left in the ground. These arguments are understandable when we examine what these subsidies are actually used for. In 2020, Shell paid negative 99.1 million in tax to the UK. Is that right? I mean, I can believe it. During the peak of COVID, the UK was the only country where Shell operated where it didn't pay tax, instead directly paying $100 million to Shell. Shell's CEO received $7 million, while the company announced plans to cut 330 North Sea jobs in January 2021. So it's probably that amount of money for the CEO is probably not quite enough to cover the jobs, but if you added other executives, maybe it would be, and shareholders. This is indicative of a wider trend. Loach, claimant in the case, climate activists and medical students, said, the UK government's support for new oil and gas not only undermines global climate goals and any sense of climate justice, it also risks wasting huge amounts of public money on projects that are more likely to line polluters' pockets than bring any real economic benefit to this country. As a country with significant historical responsibility for the climate crisis, the UK has an obligation to be one of the first to move away from oil and gas production, deliver a just transition and, like Scotland, commit to financing communities that are already dealing with the impacts of the climate crisis. Bosses win, workers lose. While many would associate the concept of maximising economic recovery with job production, instead the oil and gas sector is increasingly volatile for workers, with jobs becoming more insecure and unsafe. During the pandemic, thousands of oil workers across the UK were furloughed or fired, while executives and shareholders received millions of pounds in payouts. According to a 2020 survey, 80% of offshore oil and gas workers were considered changing jobs, indicating public mood doesn't align with government policy. The UK recently ended public support for fossil fuel projects overseas. Ending support for domestic extraction is both a logical move and a way for the UK to prove itself as a true climate leader. Global North countries like the UK have the resources, skills and a powerful renewables industry, leaving them perfectly equipped to demonstrate true leadership in the transition to a decarbonised future. Instead of using public money to prop up a declining industry, the UK has the potential to be the first major oil and gas producing country to move away from fossil fuels, setting a powerful precedent for the rest of the world. With proper government policies, green industries can create 3 times as many jobs as oil and gas. A transition led by workers, unions and affected communities presents multiple opportunities for a brighter future, and this begins with stopping the flow of public money to the oil and gas industry. There's now a very public conversation about the huge amounts of money used to prop up fossil fuels, and the conversation isn't going to go away. The pressure created by the case will only increase until the government stops supporting companies that are fueling the climate crisis and starts prioritising local communities. And let us not forget, across the world, people are winning the fight for social and climate justice. Towards the end of 2021, Shell pulled out of the Cambo oil field and Siccar Point Energy put the project on pause. A few weeks later, a court in South Africa ordered Shell to cease its oil exploration activities after massive global opposition. The work continues and the movement will not be deterred, and remember, justice is within our reach. What can consumers do? Learn more by visiting the Paid to Pollute website. Changing your bank if they're funded by fossil fuels. Consider switching energy supplier. Interesting. HSBC, yeah. HSBC is my bank, unfortunately. They don't have a great record on, well, anything ESR basically. Right, I just need a minute to get some water. I'm back. Yeah, so I mean, I think, yeah, that type of thing, like not subsidizing fossil fuel companies, right? Hello, left-hand path. It's like, it's so obvious, but it's just like, it's interesting to just see how big the subsidies are, right? Thanks for following Motion. Right, let's continue for a bit with this report. Before I go, I've got a date. I think it says a lot about me that I'd rather research climate change policy, but there you go. The global energy system is the largest source of CO2 emissions. Reducing energy sector emissions is therefore essential to limit warming. The energy systems of the future will be very different from those of today if the world successfully limits warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade. Energy will be provided, converted, and used in different ways than it is today. Achieving and responding to these changes presents an impressive range of challenges and opportunities. This is an interesting graph. It looks like it was drawn by a 4-year-old. Just like really garish colours, maybe that's the point. So, coal, primary supply, 606 EJ. 162 of those are coal, which goes into industry partly, mostly to power plants, which fund residential commercial services. Natural gas, something kind of similar, although some more of it goes directly to residential and commercial services. Nuclear, pretty small. 100% power plants. Hydro, again, small 100% power plants. Biomass, 57 EJ. It's like a substantial proportion of that of residential and commercial services, which surprised me actually. Solar's still only 4, so that's tiny, right? And that's all power plants. Interesting. Oil, 191, and that's like mostly transport, somewhat power plants. Does it not go into industry? Oh yeah, there. Wait, what's this? Oh, 20. Oh, okay, so it's a comparison. Yeah. So coal they're going to say is like less than solar now. A fair amount of natural gas still, but less. Why is nuclear so low? Nuclear is low. Is that, are they against nuclear, or is it more of a like, is it more of a prediction? Oil, small. Under what scenario is this though? This is below 2 degrees scenario. So you're looking at like more solar than anything else. A substantial amount of wind and biomass, and some natural gas and oil, but basically no coal, basically no nuclear. A little bit of geothermal, some hydro. Wait, now what's this one? Oh, 2060. So now coal's gone up. Now coal's gone up, but because there's so much carbon capture storage and gas as well, they've grown. And solar's less. But why is oil more? Wait, in 2060, so that's 2045. And solar grows low, right? So solar's 4 here, 181 EJ here, and then 70 EJ here. And then the fossil fuels go up again. Especially oil. So oil's 64 here, and 151 here, and most of it's without CCS. Right, okay. I guess if I keep reading this, it might be explained, but yeah. I don't understand that. I don't know if there's specific carbon capture technologies for specific fossil fuels. Within this context, this chapter has 2 main objectives. First, it aims to assess specific individual mitigation options in energy supply, energy transformation, and energy transportation and transmission. This assessment is complementary to a set of chapters that explore mitigation options in agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, urban systems and other settlements, buildings, transport, industry, and cross-sectoral perspectives. Second, this chapter aims to assess system-level mitigation opportunities and challenges across the entirety of energy systems. These systems include energy supply, transformation, transmission, storage, transportation, and end uses. They also include the societal systems that interact with the physical energy system. As energy systems become increasingly integrated and interconnected, a system-wide perspective is necessary for understanding mitigation opportunities and challenges. Within this context, this chapter addresses 6 topics, each of which is addressed in a separate section. First, section 6.2 defines the scope of the energy system. Section 6.3 then discusses the recent trends in energy systems that might exert the most significant influence on energy system evolution and options for reducing emissions. Section 6.4 assesses the status and potential of individual energy supply, transformation, storage, transportation and transmission, and integration mitigation options in the energy sector. Section 6.5 explores how climate change might affect energy systems and alter potential energy systems mitigation options and strategies. Section 6.6 identifies key characteristics of net zero energy systems, those that emit very little or no CO2. Section 6.7 explores transition pathways towards and through net zero energy systems. Across all of these sections, the chapters aim to explore the ways that energy sector mitigation options and strategies interact with SDGs and other societal and environmental goals. Okay, that sounds promising, but yeah. Yeah, see, Derp Feast, I think from reading about carbon capture, I'm not confident that it's scalable, right? I think it's very expensive. It's only been shown to work on a small scale. And like issues of storage are really, really problematic because finding somewhere to, because you obviously you extract carbon from from the atmosphere, right? And then you usually turn it into a solid or maybe a liquid, and then you got to put that somewhere. And it's like, where the hell do you put that? I don't know. There seems to be a lot of faith in CCCS here. Okay. I just like so much of these reports. It's just like It's just like preparing, like telling you what it's going to tell you. It's like, can you actually fucking tell me and get to the point? Right. Recent energy system trends and developments. Global energy sector emissions continue to grow but at a decreasing rate. Current energy sector emissions trends, if continued, will not limit global temperature change to well below 2 degrees centigrade. High confidence. Global energy system fossil fuel CO2 emissions grew by 4.6% between 2015 and 2019, reaching 38 gigatons of CO2 per year and accounting for approximately two-thirds of annual global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. In 2020, with the worldwide COVID pandemic, energy sector CO2 emissions dropped by roughly 2 gigatons of CO2. However, global energy-related CO2 emissions are projected to rebound by nearly 5% in 2021, approaching the 2018-2019 peak. So it kind of dropped there in COVID, but probably go back up. I'm surprised they don't have the data there. Actually, I thought they would have that by 2022. Coal was the single largest contributor to energy sector CO2 emissions between 2015 and 2019, accounting for about 44% of energy sector CO2 emissions in 2019. Right, coal is really bad. Who's the person who whose name is like I hate coal or something? That sentence is for you. Oil accounted for about 34% and natural gas accounted for about 22% of energy sector CO2 emissions. Coal, oil and natural gas CO2 emissions grew respectively by 1.2%, 2% and 12.4%. The electricity sector remains the single largest source of energy sector CO2 emissions, accounting for about 36% in 2019, followed by industry at 22% and transport, excluding international shipping and aviation transport, at about 18%. Shipping and aviation accounted for a little over 3%. These proportions have remained relatively unchanged over the last decade. Recent trends reinforce the near-term challenges facing energy sector mitigation. Electricity sector emissions continue to rise despite rapid deployment of wind and solar power. Yeah. Transportation emissions continue to rise and petroleum remains the dominant fuel, despite advances in batteries and electric cars. Some specific sectors, such as shipping and aviation, may present longer-term challenges. Energy supply greenhouse gas emissions, including CO2 and non-CO2 greenhouse gases, reached 20 gigatons of CO2 equivalent in 2019, rising by 2.7% between 2015 and 2019. Approximately 18% of energy supply emissions were non-CO2 emissions. Yeah. Isn't that just mostly methane, though? Didn't we see 18% as basically methane? Or is that total, not just energy sector? That'll mostly be methane, though, won't it? Electricity and heat contributed approximately 69% of total energy supply greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. This growth has occurred despite the high penetration of solar PV and wind power, particularly in Asia and developed countries. I didn't laugh at 69 by itself, but then with penetration just below it, I couldn't keep a straight face. Fugitive emissions from fossil fuel production, primarily methane, accounted for about 18% of sector supply emissions in 2019. Right, so that's just the same stat. It's methane. Methane is also bad. With 2.6 gigatons of CO2 a year linked to oil and gas production and 1.3 gigatons of CO2 a year to coal mining, oil and gas operations produced 2.9 gigatons of CO2 per year in 2019, split roughly equally between the two. There remains a high degree of uncertainty in methane emission estimates from oil and gas operations, despite the emergence of new data from satellites and other measurement categories. Okay, so we don't really know enough about methane emissions. According to a recent study, methane emissions are underestimated by about 25 to 40%. Yeah, methane is a whole bunch of crap. How much of that is cows then? I mean, this is about the energy sector, so maybe they won't go into it. Oh no, it's not. Yeah, sorry, it's not about cows, but a lot of methane is cows, right? Okay, so CO2 emissions by fuel. Coal has a plurality, but oil's not far behind. Natural gas, substantial amount. Energy sector, buildings, transport, power industry. Intern aviation and shipping. It's funny how little of that is actually the... I mean, it's obviously the most, the plurality, right? But it's funny how little of that is actually the generation of power. The energy sector actually releases a lot more from... Ooh, what's going on there? From other stuff. From just like having the sector. And I guess most sectors would be pretty similar because every sector has buildings and every sector has transport and aviation and shipping. Energy supply, greenhouse gas emissions, electricity and heat, oil and gas fugitive emissions, coal mining fugitive emissions, petroleum refining, mostly electricity and heat in the usual household sense of the word. Energy supply, greenhouse gas emissions. So Asia Pacific and Africa, low and steady. East Asia, growing. Europe, growing slightly. Where's North America? Grey. High and actually declining slightly, maybe. Difficult to make out. Roughly steady, probably. I think it's worse for the environment to use your coal-powered microwave, Joe. Cows are about 40% of methane. Right, thank you, Connor. That's actually less than I thought, but I guess, there's a lot of other stuff going on. Increasing global energy sector greenhouse gas emissions have been driven by rising emissions in some large developing and emerging countries. However, per capita emissions in these countries remain well below those in developed countries. From 2015 to 2019, Eastern Asia, Southern Asia, and Southeast Asia energy sector CO2 emissions grew by 2.4% a year, 2.6% a year, and 5.1% a year, respectively. The relative and absolute shares of Europe and North America have continued to decline, partly due to the growth in other countries. But this is, so we were talking about this earlier, right? This is production versus consumption. I think this is production. So Asia's risen, and no doubt Asia's consumption of fossil fuels has risen as well. The emissions attributable to their own consumption, I should say, but I think the picture's a little bit distorted. I think there's risen by more in East Asia here than would be fairly attributed to their own consumption, because it's production that's being offshored, right? That's because you see that go down in North America and in Europe. Is CO2 energy, yeah. And I don't think that's what happens. Despite the declining energy intensity, global energy system CO2 emissions have closely tracked GDP per capita. Yep. So that's one of the main points the degrowthers like to hammer home, right? This is especially true in the Asian economies, which have experienced rapid GDP per capita growth in the past decades and a massive rise in energy demand. Similarly, emissions have declined in terms of economic downturns. For example, in Eurasia in the 1990s and globally in 2009 and 2020. Population growth has also contributed to emissions growth globally and in most regions, particularly Africa, but the effect of population growth has been less than that of economic growth. Interesting. Energy intensity has been declining since 2015, limiting the impact of economic and population growth. However, there is no region where this factor alone would have been sufficient to decrease CO2 emissions from the energy system. In Europe and North America, the only two regions where emissions decreased meaningfully since 2010, a steady decrease in the carbon intensity of energy was a significant downward driver. The reduction in carbon intensity in the EU is due primarily to the increase of renewable electricity production, coupled with the low levels of fossil fuel-based production in the energy mix. Yeah. Yeah, Ator. Yeah, it's interesting. The one of the things about meat eating is like when people talk about the ethics of meat eating, they often say, "Oh, well, it'd be better ethically to have like a local organic farm that's like free range and all that type of stuff." But I think actually you're right, that is higher on emissions, which is like, it's a bit of a double bind, right? It's like almost like if you want to be more humane to the animals, you actually end up increasing your impact on the environment. And if you want to decrease your impact on the environment, you're looking at like proper industrial meat. So natural gas has increased by quite a lot. I mean, natural gas is better than coal and oil, right, in terms of its emissions. It's quite dense in terms of figures, this section, so I'm just going to... So, while energy system changes are vital to climate mitigation, recent energy system changes have arisen in response to a much broader set of factors. Important factors include economic growth, energy access, energy justice, energy security, air pollution, technological progress in low emissions technologies, and local job creation. Several of these are discussed here. Energy access. Between 2000 and 2019, the proportion of the population with access to electricity increased from 73% to 90%. Although most of those people gaining access to energy have gained access to fossil fuel-based electricity, an increasing number are gaining access to electricity from renewable sources. Low emissions, decentralized systems are proving a cost-effective way to provide electricity in rural areas. Although the use of diesel generators continues in some remote areas. Between 2000 and 2019, the proportion of the population with access to clean cooking, modern fuels and/or improved biomass cook stoves rose from 52% to 66%. Well, that's a little bit promising, isn't it? So in areas where people didn't have access to energy at all, it may be actually more cost effective to just start with renewables, especially since those areas are often sunnier, right? So yeah, the ability of countries to maintain access to reliable and affordable energy resources continues to shape energy policy. Energy security is perceived as a national security issue and often prioritized over climate concerns. The linkage between climate and energy security is now widely recognized. Approaches to energy security are frequently driven by the scope of domestic energy resources. For example, energy security concerns have led to continued reliance on domestic coal production and consumption, and increased investment in domestic renewable generation. LNG importers have diversified their sources as reliance on LNG has increased. What? Wait, what's LNG? Define your goddamn acronyms. Liquefied natural gas, okay. Air pollution. The energy system is an important source of air pollution, including both indoor and outdoor air pollution. Efforts to address air pollution in several countries and regions have had an important influence on energy system changes. Policies aimed at controlling NOx and SO2 emissions have driven emissions abatement efforts and coal fleet retirements. In some places, the prospect of reducing local air pollution remains more salient to policymakers and the public than climate mitigation when deciding to tighten regulations on coal use. This is actually an important point, right? It's quite... I think one of the things about, when you're communicating points about climate change can be very abstract, right? And people don't necessarily really grasp it. The impact that our actions have on the environment in abstract on the climate is very minimal, and it's really difficult to fully understand for everyone, right? It's not a condescending point. It's literally our brains just can't fucking process the whole thing. And so saying focusing on local air pollution, it's oh, isn't it really smoggy in London? Yes. In the tube, it's sooty, right? Things like that. Things like the emissions from a factory that's pretty close by or something like that, right? That type of thing can really resonate with people. And then obviously the net effect of that is, it's better for them. It improves health in the local area, but it also reduces overall emissions. And yeah, air pollution kills. You're right, Sith. Right, millions of people died directly because of air pollution. I heard once. I mean, I didn't check it out, but apparently living in London is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Whoops, that's in. Here we are, in capitals. Okay, so I've exaggerated that. A cigarette every couple of days. 150 cigarettes a year. When was that? 2019. Well, there are conflicting studies because this one is saying the 15 cigarettes a day. I don't know which one's correct, but anyway, certainly it's bad enough that you might as well be smoking some cigarettes. Yeah, ban cars. Ban cars, absolutely. Some studies find that a broad based carbon tax becomes progressive once you consider health effects of local pollution. That's a really interesting finding. I think maybe, yeah, it could be carbon tax could be something that maybe I could look into more specifically in a future stream. Yeah, get rid of cars in city centres, like, absolutely. When I say ban cars, I don't mean obviously everywhere for everyone. I mean mostly like seriously limit them in city centres and make it like trams, tubes, buses, cycling, and walking in cities, right? Because cars don't even achieve anything. All you need cars for is like special access. Like some people might need cars. I don't know, people with like disabilities or something like that, right? So, costs for renewable technologies have fallen significantly in recent years, driving significant changes in electricity production and transportation. These advances are not divorced from climate and other environmental concerns. Recent advances in PV cells, for example, can be traced in part to aggressive deployment strategies spurred by energy security, climate, and other environmental concerns. The falling cost of batteries, mainly lithium ion batteries, has boosted the competitiveness of electric vehicles. Successful mitigation must work in tandem with fundamental development goals such as access to modern forms of energy. In many developing countries, access to electricity, clean cooking fuels, and modern and efficient energy remain an essential societal priority. This is particularly true in sub-Saharan Africa and in several Asian countries. SDG 7 on universal access to modern energy includes targets on modern energy services, renewable energy, and energy efficiency, which implies a profound transformation of the current energy systems. Although there are different definitions of energy access, the ultimate goal is universal access to clean and modern fuels. Measuring access to energy, I don't know, I'm not especially interested in that. Despite progress in some countries such as India, Bangladesh, and Kenya, 860 million people were without access to electricity in 2018, compared with 1.2 billion in 2010. About 2.465 billion households were cooking with solid fuels, distributed across Asia and Africa. Around 850 million people in sub-Saharan Africa relied on traditional biomass, such as firewood and charcoal, for cooking, and 60 million relied on kerosene and coal to meet their energy needs. Air pollution was likely responsible for 1.1 million deaths across Africa in 2019. Right, here, this is what we were just talking about, right? It has been estimated that 2.2 billion people will still be dependent on inefficient and polluting energy sources for cooking by 2030, mainly in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, and 650 million people are likely to remain without access to electricity in 2030, 90% of whom will reside in sub-Saharan Africa. Research indicates that decentralized and on-grid renewables are likely the least cost options to provide universal access to electricity by 2030. Natural gas, LPG, and improved biomass cook stoves are the most important options for cooking. Universal access to electricity and clean cooking requires a rapid shift from traditional biomass to cleaner fuels and/or clean cooking technologies. It has been estimated that the provision of electricity and clean cooking for all would require 786 billion US dollars in cumulative investment in 2030, equivalent to 3.4% of total energy sector investment over the period. So that's the defense budget, isn't it? Oh, cumulative. That's the defense budget, right? MIT climate website. How much is emitted by manufacturing batteries? Interesting. So giving people access to like electricity and clean cooking is the defense budget, but split over 8 years. Even without universal access to modern energy, increased access will substantially affect energy systems, particularly electricity systems, through the deployment of renewable energy, LPG, and biomass supply chains. Universal access for households, however, will have a minimal impact on global energy demand. It has been estimated that universal access for households will increase energy demand by 0.2% in 2030 relative to a future without any change in access to modern energy. So this is small fry, right? I mean, this is what's frustrating. This is like the whole point about the distribution of emissions. Like giving everybody in poorer countries or poorer people in rich countries who don't have access to electricity, giving it to them is like such a small percentage of energy demand. It's like it comes from like overconsumption. Of richer people in richer countries, richer people in richer countries. Eddie R, I look forward to seeing your video on this. Does anyone know what level of education this guy has? That's Doctor Unlearning Economics to you. Okay, global coal consumption. So this is all about phasing out coal. Yeah, I mean, look, this report, this chapter of the report is 219 pages. Obviously, we're not going to. Obviously, we're not going to finish it. No, let's read this bit on coal because coal is fucking stupid, and then we'll probably finish. Yeah, okay. Coal. I hate coal. Global coal consumption has been declining with small fluctuations since it peaked in 2013. Yes. Coal is faring differently across regions. Coal use has been decreasing in the OECD regions, particularly in the US and the European Union, while remaining mostly flat in China after a period of growth, and it is continuing to increase in other major developing Asian economies. Trends in the electricity sector where most coal is being consumed are similar. Growth in coal-fired electricity generation capacity in the Asia-Pacific region has offset retirements in North America and Europe. Asia-Pacific, okay, so they're using coal more, and they seem to be the only ones. Reductions in coal consumption have been driven in large part by non-climate factors, most notably environmental regulations to address air pollution, rapidly declining costs of renewables, and lower natural gas prices, especially inexpensive unconventional gas in the US. Right, fracking. That's a whole nother can of worms, isn't it? Older coal-fired power plants that cannot meet new environmental regulations or have become unprofitable or uncompetitive have been closed in many regions. Moreover, coal power expansion has slowed down in Asia as countries have suspended and cancelled new projects for reasons such as overcapacity, environmental constraints, and the development of renewables. That's good. Different regions have replaced retired coal with different energy sources. Old coal fleets have been replaced approximately half by gas and half by renewables in the US, mainly by renewables in the European Union, and by advanced coal plants and renewables in Asia. Okay, so that's a real mixed bag, although definitely an improvement. Replacing old coal with new coal facilities is inconsistent with limiting warming to 2 degrees centigrade or below. Yeah, okay. So just no coal. I don't understand though, because the thing that they showed us earlier was like, there was like loads of coal in it. Does anyone remember that? Look. Hey, there it is. So it starts with this much coal, 162 EJ, like, what, a quarter of total? And then it goes down to like nothing in 2045. 1.7. Then it goes back up to 111, but then they say it's carbon capture storage. But then they're saying we shouldn't invest in coal. Is that because we have to wait until the carbon capture storage is sufficiently developed to invest in coal, which it's not, so we shouldn't be doing it now? That would be the best. I don't know. Again, CCCS, I wish we had time to go into it. That's probably the next thing I'd do, to be honest, because it's like, I'm not sure about it. Major coal-consuming countries with abundant coal reserves remain far from phasing out coal. In most developing countries with large coal reserves, coal use has been increasing to support energy security and because it is perceived to have lower costs than alternatives. However, coal faces increasing business risks from the decreasing costs of alternative low-emissions energy sources and increasing focus on air pollution and other environmental impacts from coal mining and use. Continued coal builds, mostly in developing countries, will increase the risks of stranded assets. See box 6.13. But is stranded assets? I mean, yeah, okay, it's a waste of money, isn't it? But like, they seem really concerned about stranded assets, and I was just, in my opinion, it's like, if we have an oil field, right, and we have enough electricity or energy, you know, not to use it, why would we not just like abandon it? It's a stranded asset. Like what the fuck are they? Venture capitalists, or are they fucking climate scientists? I don't know. Anyway, economic, social and employment impacts of accelerated coal phase-outs tend to be significant in coal-dependent regions. Tailored redeployment has been used to support coal transitions in some regions, although some estimates show higher employment opportunities from low-carbon energy. Results vary across regions. Moreover, even with a net increase in total employment, in the long run, renewable jobs are often located outside of coal regions and require different skill sets from the coal industry. In a broader sense, achieving a just transition also requires managing the impacts on regional economic development for coal-dependent communities and the effects of higher energy prices for consumers and energy-intensive industries through a comprehensive policy package. Yeah, it's tricky that, because you're living in a bit of a fantasy world if you're just like, oh well, all of these coal workers, they're just gonna work in renewables. It's like, well, obviously they're not, right? Yeah, it is the sunken cost fallacy, Sithil, the stranded assets thing. I like sunken cost fallacy over sunk cost fallacy. Sunken sounds like it's like an old city, like Atlantis or something. Yeah, so, I mean, how do you manage that? I mean, you could use the Swedish model with employment where you basically just support people, but I think people want jobs as well. Like, they don't just want, like, money necessarily. It's tricky because it's very intertwined with community and identity and things like that. But still, again, the climate doesn't care about any of that. Limiting global warming to 2 degrees or below requires a rapid shift away from unabated coal consumption in the energy system by 2050. This will require cancellation of new coal power projects and accelerated retirement of existing coal plants. To limit warming to 2 degrees centigrade or below, and without new builds, existing coal plants will need to retire 10 to 25 years earlier than the historical average operating lifetime. Completing all planned projects will further reduce the viable lifetime of all plants by 5 to 10 years if warming is to be limited to 2 degrees or below. Right, so we need to just like stop burning coal and it's just like abandon a lot of them. Phasing out coal in the next few decades will present economic, social and security challenges. These will vary across regions based on the characteristics of existing coal infrastructure, the availability of alternatives, economic development, and technological and institutional lock-in. Number of retired units. Age by retirement. Existing capacity only. So if we just let that go, I guess the greys, like, the light grey is kind of like, if we just let it go on as long as it could, and then the dark grey or black is like, no, I actually don't know what those mean. I don't know what those shades of grey mean. But anyway, basically, we need to force plants to stop producing to be limited to 1.5 or even 2 degrees. And then you got new construction here as well, right? Between 2015 and 2019, global coal power capacity grew by 146 gigawatts, or 7.6%, as new builds offset retirements in some countries. Meanwhile, an increasing number of countries and regions have committed to or operationalised coal phase-outs. Actions are being taken by various international and subnational actors, including national and subnational governments, public and private power companies, and financial institutions and pension funds that have committed to not to fund new coal or coal-based infrastructure. Right. Divestment. Although these initial efforts are not yet sufficient in limiting warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, and most have occurred in regions with older coal fleets, these examples provide insight into possible coal phase-out strategies and help identify the mechanisms driving the move away from coal, such as market, technology, policy, or other societal objectives. They also enable better understanding of the possible character of oil and gas phase-downs that would ultimately be needed to limit warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade. Typo. 2. T-O. Right. So, yeah, I think it goes into detail on the different continents. I think I've got to go. Let me mark where we were, just in case we come back to it. It's kind of hoping that these would be like... I was kind of hoping that these would be like a bit more accessible, or like some of the executive summaries would be a bit more accessible, you know, like, and I think like elements of these reports have been useful. Like this part especially, the energy chapter seems to have been fairly useful, but it's pretty dense and in one way is at a level of detail that I'm not necessarily like that interested in, while also maybe not going into as much detail as I would like on the policies. So I think, yeah, like I mean, my overall what we've learned, what I've learned, or what we've learned is like essentially the scale of the change in the energy system needs to be massive, like bigger than I thought actually. We need to look at basically completely eliminating coal, and we need to look at basically completely eliminating oil as far as I'm aware. And you know, natural gas can maybe form some part of the future because it's relatively low emissions if it's a relatively low proportion, but it's like you are looking at just like massive shifts in the energy system towards renewables, but also towards like non-renewables that are non-carbon emitting. I mean, I didn't get into it, but they were talking about ammonia, they were talking about like biomass and things like that. So it's like I think next time, because I want to do another one of these about climate change, but I think I'll probably go more down the policy angle, and we can look at like some things like carbon taxes people were talking about, like cars. We're talking about passive housing, right? Things like that. I think that'd be worth. Yeah, yeah. You're right. IPCC, like it's difficult for them because they're trying to keep as scientific as possible, I think, and they're conservative, right? Like I think carbon capture storage, another thing I'd like to look into, but my impression is that it's not that great, and they're being optimistic about it. So I think they might be being conservative, if anything, but I don't know. Wait, what? Okay. So yeah. So thanks everybody, and I will see you all soon. I'm doing. What am I doing on Tuesday? Oh, I'm speaking to someone. About economics. Another YouTuber actually. So that should be fun. But we'll do another climate change stream, and I think probably swerve the IPCC reports because this has been pretty intense. So thanks for staying with me. And yeah, now I really do have to go to my date. See you all later.